the first time I went to see my primary care doctor, I had one eye on performance still, even though, I had terrible insomnia, these horrible gut symptoms. I was still thinking, I bet this doctor guy, I bet if he can fix this stuff, it can improve my sports performance. That's what I wasn't thinking. It would just make me a healthier, better human, more fun to be around. It was all about sports performance. And I see the folly of that now. Right now, I'm old and 45. I'm not really racing at the highest level anymore. I still have a pro license, but come on, I'm not doing 20, 30 hours a week of training anymore. So I'm never going to be that competitive. But yeah, it was that pursuit of performance that got me into trouble.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Doing creative work can be kind of lonely, and that's why we built the Unmistakable Listener Tribe. The tribe is a community for professionals to connect and support each other. Everything is designed to help you grow your business and share what's working and what isn't. And that's true whether you're a business owner or an artist. You'll get access to feedback, live conversations with guests, and so much more. By joining the tribe, you become part of a community of creators who all support each other, and it's completely free. Hopefully I'll see you there. Visit unmistakablecreative.com/tribe to join. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Chris, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you for having me and allowing me to bring down the house prices. I really appreciate it.
Well, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I was referred to you by way of our mutual friend and former Unmistakable Creative guest, Nick Notice, who I think the world of. And, he told me a little bit about what you did. And I thought, yeah, this is fascinating. But before we get into your work, I want to start by asking you, where in the world did you grow up? And what impact did that end up having on the choices that you've made throughout your life and your career?
Oh, one thing I noticed from listening to your podcast is you really ask good questions. And the reason I know that is because you hear the guests say, oh, you ask good questions. So to answer your question, I'm British. I'm currently living in Santa Cruz in California. I grew up in a rather boring town called Newbury in Berkshire. And if anyone's listening from there, they'll probably send me hate mail now, but it's true. It's kind of boring. And I went to university in Southampton, which is on the south coast. And then I moved to London, which is where everyone seemed to end up. So I was kind of reunited with some of my old school friends there. And we had a great time. And I worked for some interesting companies. I worked for a telco startup there, had a really good time, and then eventually ended up working for Yahoo, who you'll probably remember.
Yeah.
not as popular as they once used to be, right? They were very kind. They gave me the opportunity to move over to California. And so I worked in Sunnyvale in California in Silicon Valley for a few years, lived in San Francisco. So that opportunity to go to London and get the opportunity from Yahoo was just amazing.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the sort of contrast in terms of social values, in terms of just lifestyle and all of that versus the, your time in the US versus UK, like what have you noticed as the difference? And, what do you think that your upbringing from being abroad has had on the way that your life has turned out here?
I noticed that America is very much more polarized. Does that resonate with you? Do you notice that?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Especially in the last few years, I think it didn't seem as much, but I feel like in the last probably 4 years after the Trump presidency, much more so. Although Ezra Klein wrote this book about this called Polarized, and he said that basically this has been going on for a very long time. It's just been much more amplified recently.
Oh, you really notice it. So not just the politics. I think in the UK, everything's very much more centrist. There's three parties, but they're all kind of in the center. There's not much to choose between them. But then also in the people that I met some of the smartest people I have ever met. I worked in finance for a while, quantitative finance. You'd meet all these mathematicians. Some of you had PhDs from Princeton. Holy cow, they were just so smart. And then also met some people that seemed a lot less smart, not wishing to be too unkind. Whereas in the UK, everyone's kind of in the middle again, I'm sure there are some people as smart as the ones I've met, but I've not met them yet, So I feel like everything's a lot more polarized.
Yeah, I get the sense you said, we're not just talking in terms of politics, but you mentioned finance, which is like a breeding ground for ambitious, highly motivated, super smart people. What have you noticed about the sort of narrative around sort of drive, ambition, and success, here versus the one you grew up with, particularly because you have this contrast of London and Silicon Valley, which is yet another place where, relentless ambition is, not only encouraged, but rewarded, even when it's pushed to the point of diminishing returns, as we've seen, in the last few years with things like, Theranos and, WeWork and all these stories.
Oh, that's a really good point you raise again. Yeah, I think in the UK, a job is something you do, and it's not really that important in your life, I would say. It's not as important. And often it's just about a nice place to go to meet your friends during the day. Like all my friends from the UK have been working from home for the last year, like everyone else, at least all the knowledge workers. And they're desperate to go back because that's their social life. They want to see all their friends. Whereas in the US, I feel like that's kind of different. Like I don't know as many people who are as keen to go back. And I think you're right. I think there is more of a culture of relentless pursuit of stuff, right? You might call it the hedonic treadmill. And I actually interviewed an author of a book, Brad Stulberg. He has a book called The Passion Paradox. So this is a book. You've read that book. So I interviewed Brad for my podcast, and he talked about this. And he talked about Theranos specifically, and Lance Armstrong. The cyclist. It's this kind of the relentless pursuit leads to burnout and cheating. So yeah, again, another interesting that you've picked up on that cultural difference between the US and the UK.
Yeah, what impact do you think that has on the overall quality of life and sense of fulfillment and satisfaction that people have in their lives when you contrast the two? Do you think that people in the UK are happier because they live that way? Do you think that people in the US are less happy because they're so driven?
Yeah, I think this is ancient wisdom, isn't it? Wasn't it the Buddha that said that craving is the source of all suffering? I think that in the US, people crave change and, the next thing much more than in the UK. So I think probably people in the UK are more satisfied with the life. They're just more chilled and contented with what they've already got.
Well, but clearly on some level you weren't. I mean, I don't think you do what you do, ending up, in the UK working in finance, working at Yahoo. And I know you're also a professional mountain biker, which, by the way, how do those two things coexist?
Yeah,
I thought that was like a fairly time consuming occupation to be a pro mountain biker.
That's another great observation. Yeah, I became a kind of junkie for those ecstatic peak states that come from, surfing. I kind of know surfing. I can't surf, but I kiteboard, and it's kind of the same. I live here in Santa Cruz, and we get some great waves, and the wind is also really good. So, sometimes I get down there, and I've got my kite. So I'm cheating. Rather than paddling out onto the waves, I'm using a kite to pull me onto the waves. It's like doping in surfing, right?
Hey, on my list of things to do, by the way, so you may have to teach me, because I learned that, on a kite, you can do all this stuff that you can't do on a surfboard without the skills you need, like launching airs.
Oh, it's insane. I've heard you talk about how waves don't come, completely periodically. They come in sets, right? Like it's not the same rhythm all the time. And, you see a set come in and you've got a kite, you can get every single wave, right? Like you could get all of them. That's the advantage. And I do think it's easy because you've got something pulling you up, you see. Like you can't really get pummeled in quite the same way as you can when you're surfing because there's something pulling you up all the time, Totally. But yeah, I think, it was the love of those extreme sports, if you will, that persuaded me it was a good idea to move from London to California. It's really, living in London, central London is really frustrating. Come the weekend, it can take 2 hours just to get out the city to anything remotely resembling nature. And I really wasn't into that. I was commuting from London to Wales to ride my mountain bike every weekend. And this is stupid, whereas in California, where I am now in Santa Cruz, there's trails everywhere. I can just ride straight from my house. It's fantastic. So it's kind of the pursuit of those peak states, dropping into a wave or riding the perfect trail. That was kind of what persuaded me to move to California.
Yeah. Well, so what was the sort of seed that sparked your interest in extreme sports? Because for me, it was just a random day on the beach in Brazil where I stood up for the first time on a surfboard and I thought, holy shit, it was a religious experience. And people who have described downhill mountain biking to me, I remember Stephen Kotler describing this to me once. He said, the first time you go down, you're like, holy shit, that was terrifying. The second time you're like, all right, that wasn't so bad. By the third time you go down, he says, damn, these bikes are really expensive. I need to figure out how to buy one. He says it's that quick in terms of the flow that it creates. But what sparked your interest in this? And how did you get into it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I just interviewed Jamie Wheel, who is the co-author with Stephen Kotler on Stealing Fire. Jamie's got a new book, Recapture the Rapture, you probably enjoy as well. And, my journey into mountain biking is exactly what you just said, right? I've got, some Finnish friend who sadly is no longer alive, took me mountain biking. I mean, I'd done it as a kid. I sort of knew. I just wasn't ready to experience it when I was 13 or 14. And so it was only in my early 20s when this guy took me out and I experienced exactly what you just said. And actually, he was the same guy that introduced me to snowboarding as well. He's like, oh, you must come with me to Austria and, we'll bring my Austrian buddy and he knows all the local whatever. And yeah, within 15 minutes, I'm completely hooked on it. It's just so easy to get.
This episode of The Unmistakable Creative is brought to you by ThoughtWorks, a global technology consultancy that's hiring senior and lead developers, data engineers, infrastructure consultants, and more to join them in their roles across the United States. It's pretty clear that last year changed our working lives forever, and maybe it made you realize that you were ready for a change. At ThoughtWorks, they challenge curious minds to make a real impact, get to know them, and discover how you can make your mark in tech. At ThoughtWorks, you're free to seek the most ambitious challenges, free to change career paths, free to use technology as a tool for social change, and free to be yourself. They're looking for change makers, opportunity creators, status quo shakers, thoughtworkers. And if you're listening to The Unmistakable Creative, that's probably you. Learn more and apply at thoughtworks.com/careers. Again, that's thoughtworks.com/careers. This episode of The Unmistakable Creative is supported by Command Line Heroes. Command Line Heroes is a podcast that tells the epic true tales of developers, programmers, hackers, geeks, and open source rebels who are revolutionizing the technology landscape. And Season 7 is available now. This season, Command Line Heroes explores a pivotal year, 1995. It was the start of the dot-com boom, but a lot of things had to come together for the internet to succeed. Meet the internet class of 1995. Did you know that long before you could hop on GoDaddy to grab a domain name, there was a woman you'd have to call? Elizabeth Jake Feinler was the keeper of all domains, and episode 1 of the season features a conversation with the woman herself, now in her 90s, about how she managed the internet and how her team needed to create the DNS. I got a sneak preview of Season 7 of Command Line Heroes, and here's what I thought. Depending on how old you are, you might remember a time when the internet wasn't part of our lives and looked nothing like it did today. Or those awful days of dial-up when your parents would be yelling at you to get off the internet so they could use the phone. Command Line Heroes is a fascinating look at the evolution of the internet as we know it today. Command Line Heroes is hosted by developer and podcaster Saran Yabarik. Search for Command Line Heroes anywhere you listen to podcasts, and thanks to Command Line Heroes for their support.
Into.
Yeah. Were you a naturally athletic person? Because I'm sure you've heard me mention this before if you've heard a few episodes where I have no natural athletic ability.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that to me, when I think about extreme sports and what draws me to them is the exercise is a fringe benefit. That is not at all why I do any of those things. Nobody, you talk to any of them, but I think it takes a certain personality type. I feel the people who tend to be drawn towards extreme sports are the people who suck at team sports. I was terrible on my basketball team. It was the most improved player, which just means you're the shittiest player on the team. And I loved the fact that in an extreme sport like snowboarding or surfing, if your performance sucks, nobody else's suffers as a result.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Personality-wise that drew you, and what do you think it is that draws people to this? I mean, obviously the flow is a big thing. I know that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, so I played football. You call it soccer over here in the US. At school and rugby because I was forced to, and it sucked. I hated it, and so I don't think that's a coincidence that later on you do get into movement, but it's of the individual kind. It's not really a team sport, mountain biking, is it? No. And to answer your question, no, I think I did have a certain amount of innate talent. Kind of how I got into the racing was through snowboarding. Actually, in San Francisco. You would quite often have people sharing a house up at Tahoe. And I find these people through Craigslist. Somebody would lease a big house and then get 12 people from the internet to share it. And, I met a bunch of my friends when I first moved to California that way. And one of those guys, I just happened to bump into him on the trails in Marin. And he was going to do a lap of some trails called Tamarancho, which is not far from San Francisco. And he said, oh, yeah, you can sort of ride with me for the first lap, but the second lap, I'm really going to throw the hammer down. And so you probably won't be able to keep up. And I was able to keep up. It was all very, very easy. When we finished the ride, he said, you know what, you're pretty fast. You should come with me to a bike race this weekend, which I did. And of course I did well. And then you're like, oh shit, now what? Like, what might be possible if this is what I can do, having done no training and with no coach and not really any deliberate effort whatsoever, what might be possible? So that was kind of my slippery journey into racing bikes.
Wow. Well, so let's talk about this, because this is the part that really interests me about your story, is because, I think what got me when Nick mentioned what you did was I was like, okay, this is a lot about sort of peak performance and, stuff that overlaps with a lot of the stuff that Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel do. Especially at that age, right? Because typically when people become world-class in an athletic pursuit, they start when they're young. It's like LeBron James holding a basketball at age 12. You kind of know that, okay, this guy is destined for greatness, but this happened quite later in your life. So what is it that enables somebody later in life to do something that physically demanding, especially at the level that you've done it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think partly the answer is choosing the right sport, right? I don't think, someone who takes up basketball in their mid-30s is ever going to turn pro, right? There's no way. Whereas you look at most endurance athletes, they tend to peak around that age. Wouldn't you agree? You definitely get some world-class and even world champion youngsters, but a lot of the pro peloton, it's like guys in their early 30s, it's quite often. You see people still winning in their late 30s. So I think that's part of it. I wasn't sedentary my whole life. I've been riding bikes my whole life. I just didn't realize that I was actually quite quick and that I would do well in racing. So it was really just the discovery part. And I think this is even really much more common for women. They don't know, they've never really had the opportunity. They've never been introduced to the sport. And so it's even more common to find women who go from never having ridden a bike to being world champion. Marianne Vos, I think, is a good example of that. It's just because they didn't just never realize, just never found out.
Yeah. Kelley Slater apparently is the only athlete to have basically been dominant in his sport for 4 decades. But so what, when you are able to do this, what actually goes into the training? How much of it is mindset? How much of it is physical? What is involved in this?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think about this a lot. And, I think I made some mistakes in the beginning in trying to separate out all the different component parts. And not realizing that everything was all connected, So I hired a coach, and the coach was actually very good. They created a program for me. And I'd say the first thing they did for me was actually get me to slow down. I used to ride everywhere as fast as I possibly could because I thought that's what would make me faster. It does sort of make sense when you think about it from a simplistic sense, but I completely undervalued recovery, which is where the magic happens. So obviously that's problematic. So that was quite good, but still, as I upped the volume, I did more and more volume on the bike to the point where I'm doing 20 hours a week of cycling. And gradually the wheels came off the wagon. And I know now, looking back, that the reason that happened was multifactorial, but diet was a big part of it. I just ate more of the food that I'd been eating my whole life and was probably making me sick, which was cereal for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, right? Just tons and tons of that. And then when I was on the bike, I would consume buckets of those maltodextrin gels. I'd get back from a ride and I'd have 9 of these things all stuck together in my jersey pocket. And, that's what you did. I asked the coach, should I be taking these maltodextrin gel things? He's like, yeah, everyone does that. That's a good idea. You should go for it. And I ended up being the dealer. I'm a member of a cycling club and I'm the guy that gets the deal on the maltodextrin gels. And I think I did a lot of damage to my health that way. And in the end, I ended up at my primary care doctor because that's where you go when you're not feeling good, right? Health and fitness, they're these 2 separate things. And if it's not fitness, then it must be health. There's a false dichotomy there, I think. So I go to the doctor and the doctor's not interested in my cycling performance at all. But he says, well, yeah, okay, you've got some gut symptoms. So go see the gastroenterologist. So you get palmed off to this specialist and the specialist says, well, it's nothing to do with your diet. This is just what happens. It's genetic or something like that. Something fixed, something that can't be altered. And they said that they had some steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. And then when those stopped working, they had surgery. And that doesn't sound like a path anyone wants to take, right? But luckily, around that time, I met the woman who is now my wife. And she'd recently been studying food allergies in the lab as part of her master's degree. And she said, you should really try an elimination diet before you go for the steroid anti-inflammatory drugs and surgery. because it's a lot less invasive. And hey, what have you got to lose? So I did that. I went on to what people now call the Paleo Autoimmune diet, although, I mean, it was called that then, but there were hardly any resources. So my wife had to do a lot of research to sort of put together a diet. And she saved me. She fixed me up and she saved me. So I never did take the steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, and I never did do the surgery. And I recovered my gut health, no more bloating, no more diarrhea. And I started sleeping. Like, it's really hard to sleep well when your gut's all messed up. And I started enjoying biking again. Like, I realized with hindsight that the joy had sort of gone out of it, because it's just not fun to do shit. I mean, you know this from surfing. Like, try putting on a wetsuit, when you're bloated and you feel like you might shit your pants at any minute. Like, that's not fun,
that
is
is
it?
like the worst case scenario. You literally dread that possibility because you're just like, you're in the water. You're like, oh man, now I got to go take this damn thing off. And that is literally the thing we always all dread. Especially because you surf first thing in the morning.
Right. Yeah, I know. And it ruined kiteboarding for me as well, because, I mean, it's the same deal. You've got to put this wetsuit on. The California Pacific water is very cold. So I'm wearing like a 5, whatever it is, 5'2" or 5'3" wetsuit. And then you put this waist harness on, right? That's like really tight around your waist because the kite clips into it. And so that felt awful. You know, this thing needs to be tight, but when you tighten it, it's like squeezing down on this basketball bloated belly. Like, that wasn't fun. And then on top of that, I think my gut dysfunction was then causing some hormonal problems, including low testosterone, low libido, but also low thyroid. And thyroid makes cells do what they do. And people who are hypothyroid, meaning they have low thyroid function, they're quite often really cold. And I was bloody freezing. And so, snowboarding, being in the freezing cold water, that was not fun at all. So some of these sports started to fall to the wayside just because of the hormonal changes I was experiencing from gut problems.
Yeah. Well, so I think this actually makes a perfect segue to talking about sort of what led you to doing the work that you do today. But one of the things that I wonder about is how much of this was driven by your desire to compete at the level that you were competing? Because I think we've seen, with like Lance Armstrong, what happens when that competitive drive becomes so intense that you're willing to basically break the rules of a sport. I mean, we've seen it over and over again, and it leads to some pretty awful outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was all about performance. The first time I went to see my primary care doctor, I had one eye on performance still, even though, I had terrible insomnia, these horrible gut symptoms. I was still thinking, I bet this doctor guy, I bet if he can fix this stuff, it can improve my sports performance. That's what I wasn't thinking. It would just make me a healthier, better human, more fun to be around. It was all about sports performance. And I see the folly of that now. Right now, I'm old and 45. I'm not really racing at the highest level anymore. I still have a pro license, but come on, I'm not doing 20, 30 hours a week of training anymore. So I'm never going to be that competitive. But it was that pursuit of performance that got me into trouble.
What shifted? Was it the actual health consequences or mindset? Like, what changed that made you rethink that whole pursuit of performance? Because, I mean, think about it. Like, everybody who comes to self-improvement, whether it's through fitness, whether it's through, seminars, whether it's through books, I think is looking for some semblance of an improvement in performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm one of those rare birds that can, as soon as I find out that something is not the best way or there is a better way, I can just drop it and change. And I know that is not normal. Like, most people are not like that. I'm not the customer in many ways, but that's definitely one of them. Most people find behavior change hard. And, people have an emotional relationship with food, right? They don't want to give up their breakfast cereal because that's what I've always eaten since I was a kid. And it reminds me of being a kid. And it reminds me of all this stuff. Like, whereas I'm just like, oh, really? What? The cereal might be causing my gut problems? It's gone. Like, the next day, it's gone.
No.
And so I'm kind of unusual in that regard.
But was there a moment that made you say that, okay, you know what, this is clearly going to lead to somewhere bad, just based on health? Like, what made you change or let go of that competitive drive and put your health above your performance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, there was a kind of fuck it moment. I sort of skipped out this part because it's not easy to talk about. So there was a girl that came before the woman I married, and the reason that relationship ended was because of erectile dysfunction. I got kicked off somebody's stoop because I couldn't get it up. And I think that was the fuck it moment. You're like, I guess I can't really keep doing this. Like, the sports performance is important to me, but so is sex, and so is having a relationship, And so that was kind of the moment where I'm like, I'm going to have to like compromise some performance here. And the interesting thing was, when I slowed down and when I figured out the diet, when I figured out my insomnia, when I figured out how to manage stress and, figured out social connectedness as well. I think I was suffering from loneliness, having being a foreigner in a foreign country, and just racing was my entire existence. When I wasn't racing, I was resting on the couch. I think I was pretty lonely. When I figured all that stuff out and got super healthy, then the performance came. It was just an emergent phenomena from health, and it was only then that I got my pro license. And so, it kind of worked out. Being forced to slow down by the erectile dysfunction eventually led to increased performance, but I didn't see it that way in the beginning,
Yeah. Well, I mean, so how does that take us to Nourish, Balance, Thrive? I mean, I think what got my attention was the fact that you are doing science-based work around all of this. And I know for a fact there are a lot of people who use a sample size of one and call it science, and, sell it and package it and market it really well. But I think, you really it struck my attention that Nick brought that up, and he said you were doing some really innovative work around, blood work related to performance. So how in the world did you get into this?
Yeah. I mean, I just wondered, after I'd been through this, after I'd recovered my gut health and I was sleeping and I'm feeling so much more energetic and my relationship is going well. You have to wonder how many other people have been through the same thing. And I got a lucky break in that I had the opportunity to speak on Ben Greenfield's podcast. And I think I did that so one of my friends is a medical doctor. Her name's Jamie Kendall-Weed. And she was kind of disenfranchised with her work at the time. She just finished medical school. She's got this $250,000 education, starts work on Monday morning. You've got 30 patients to see and you've got 7 minutes with each of them. So imagine that, the kind of the guy that had just been kicked off that girl's stoop, that's still eating cereal for breakfast. I show up at her clinic and she's got 7 minutes to fix me. I mean, what the fuck? She can't do anything in 7 minutes, right? And the only tool she has is the prescription pad. And so, she was seeing this over and over again. She was pretty disenfranchised. And, we saw the opportunity to start a startup, went on Ben Greenfield's podcast. I told a story very similar to the one that you just heard. And a bunch of people came to me and said, hey, that's exactly what happened to me. Whatever you did, tell me the diet that you ate. Tell me the supplements you took. Tell me the tests that you did. Send it all to me. Here's my credit card number. I want the transformation that you had. And that was the genesis of MBT.
Wow. Well, so let's talk about what happens. How do you get to this, place of, feeling nourished, balanced, and thriving in your life? What are the sort of foundational aspects of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I've already been through some of them. Fairly recently, within the last couple of years, I got lucky. In fact, this has been true. This is part of why I'm still here today, is over the years, a lot of really smart people have come along and taken me under their wing and given me guidance. And many of those people are doctors of the medical variety. And then some have been PhDs. And many of them have been on my podcast. And I think one of the most useful has been a neurologist by the name of Josh Turknet. And he gave me a 4-quadrant model that allowed me to prioritize health interventions. And this, I think, is important because when I talk to clients, a lot of them are really confused about what's important and what's not. And they say things like, I've tried everything and nothing works. And what they mean is that they've tried a million things, some of which were really important, some of which weren't important at all, and not given them an honest try, and they haven't really seen much benefit. So this 4-quadrant model, it allows me to prioritize interventions. So quadrant 1 are the things that we think about first. And there are things like I've already mentioned, right? The ancestral diet, which means meat and vegetables, some fruit, and not much added fat, almost no processed food at all. And then, sleep, circadian rhythm. Humans and our ancestors have been walking around under the same light-dark cycle for millions of years. Now we have electric lighting, right? And you can make it daytime at night. That was definitely part of my problem in the beginning. And then what else? Appropriate stress management. Some of the cognitive tools that are available today, like acceptance and commitment therapy is my favorite. Just so useful for managing stress. And then what else? And then you get into once you've got that foundational stuff, you've got the quadrant 2 things. Mm-hmm. And these are things that disrupt the physiology, disrupt the status quo in some beneficial way. And so those are things like training on your bike and lifting weights and Wim Hof style breathing and fasting and hot cold exposure and all this other stuff. But that really is sort of the icing on the cake. You know, you need this foundation in place before you can start putting the icing on the cake. And then you get into what we might call the quadrant 3 or the source code level stuff. And this is where things start getting sexy in terms of a business model. You know, like now I can start making money, right? It's like really hard to make money selling dietary interventions and sleep interventions. And it's really hard to make money even selling the quadrant 2 stuff like weightlifting programs or something like that. I mean, it's all coaching, right? It's all exchanging your time for money. But once you get into the source code level stuff, now you've got something that's looks more like a scalable business model. So this is where all nutritional supplements lie, right? So maybe I do a blood test and I find, let's just pick something arbitrary, low levels of vitamin D, 25 hydroxy vitamin D on a blood chemistry. And I mean, of course, the best way to improve that is to get outside into the sunshine, right? That would be the quadrant 1 intervention. But I could also sell you a supplement, right? And the supplement, like I don't need to exchange any of my time to make money for the supplement. So that's a much better business model. Unfortunately, MBT is not really a startup. You know, I think about that a lot now, that in the beginning I thought I was starting a startup. And what I mean by that is exponential growth. But what we actually started was a business model that more closely resembles a barbershop, you know, where people come in and they get their hair cut, right? And if you were to send me 1,000 clients tomorrow, I would just crumble and die, right? Like, there's no way that we could see 1,000 people at once. Yeah. And so, you know, that's the kind of, we're more tending towards the barbershop model. And you can get nutritional supplements from us, but that's not really where we go first. And it's certainly not where we make our money. So that's the quadrant 3. And of course, there's lots of things like that, the zinc and magnesium and like, you know, all these things that could potentially be deficient and often are, you know, nutritional deficiencies are definitely real. And we find them all the time with the testing that we do in our clinic, mostly blood testing. But then you get into the quadrant 4 things, which is, you know, you're sort of tinkering in the source code, but then you're also trying to exploit the status quo, the physiology, a bit like weightlifting, you know, like, and this is kind of all pharmaceuticals, right? So, you know, maybe statin drugs are a good example of that, where you're trying to lower cholesterol levels in the hope that somehow it reduces cardiovascular disease. And yeah, maybe you got something there, but I don't think any cardiologist would argue that sleep is less important than the statin, right? Like, that seems self-evident. And then the only time that pharmaceuticals really work really well is when the physiology is hopelessly broken. So in type 1 diabetes is a really good example, right? Your pancreas is completely broken. It's not making any insulin whatsoever. If you don't replace that insulin, you're going to die. And so you have to inject it. Like, that's a really good use of pharmaceuticals, but pretty much everything else, right? I don't think they work so good. And maybe that's part of the reason why, you know, we've gotten into so much trouble today in Western societies like the UK and the US, is this over-reliance on the quadrant 4 as the first line intervention, right? Like, that's what Jamie's doing when she sees people as a primary care doctor. Yeah. So yeah, I think that model, the algorithm for prioritizing health interventions, has maybe been the most important thing I've learned since starting MBT.
So this is a different kind of sponsorship, but this episode is actually brought to you by my good friend, Peter Shallard. He's the founder of Commit Action and known as the Shrink for Entrepreneurs. So why is he sponsoring Unmistakable Creative? If you want to be more productive, less stressed, and ultimately happier and more successful, then you need to hear about accountability coaching. Commit Action pairs you with a dedicated coach to act as your second brain, helping you to break down big goals, prioritize, and execute consistently. A lot of the reviews on TrustPilot describe Commit Action as literally life-changing. And as an Unmistakable Creative listener, you'll get $100 off your first month's coaching when you use Creative100 at checkout. So if you want to become a productivity powerhouse, then go to www.commitaction.com and give it a try. And if you're curious and you want to hear more of Peter's story, he and I went deep in our recent episode about the psychology of highly productive entrepreneurs that went live on May 3rd. Give it a listen to hear his take on all things entrepreneurial psychology.
Wow. Well, I love this whole idea of a 4-quadrant model because I like mental models and I geek out on them, and it like helps me to put things in context. But let's take a look at this through a practical example, I think, because then, you know, I think it'll help people sort of frame. So I'll use, you know, out of my selfish desire to have you solve one of my problems, I'll use myself as an example. It's funny you mentioned the vitamin D deficiency because I remember a doctor told me that I was, you know, vitamin D deficient, and my sister was like, "That's ridiculous." She's a doctor. She's like, "You're a surfer. You're in the sun all the time." And it turns out people with dark skin actually tend to have vitamin D deficiencies, which I had no idea.
Mm.
But let's use a simple example. A few weeks ago, I was home visiting my dad, and he was like, look, man, he was like, you gained some weight. He was like, I think you need to lose your gut a little bit. It's like, thanks, Dad. It was nice to see you too. Like on the way home from the airport, this is back. He was dropping me off, and so I was like, all right, fair enough. Like he's not wrong because of COVID. Like our exercise habits have suffered a little bit. I hadn't been snowboarding as much this season. We're kind of stuck inside doing nothing but work all the time. So let's just use that as an example. So if we're going to say, okay, we're going to help Srini trim his gut so he can fit into his nice custom fitted dress shirts again, where would we begin?
Yeah, that's a really good example, isn't it? It's all diet, unfortunately. I interviewed Herman Poncer, and he has a new book called Burn. And Herman talks about his constrained energy model. And the good news is you're in control. The bad news is it's all diet, and you can't outrun a bad diet. The brain is very clever. It has ways of making adjustments to compensate when you move more. So, for example, when I'm riding my bike 20 hours a week, I'm just going to turn down immunity, which is why athletes tend to get sick more, especially after races. It's going to turn down reproduction, which is why you get erectile dysfunction, low testosterone. It makes perfect sense, right? Like if there's not much energy around, then because you're spending it all on locomotion, then you turn down these other optional things. So it's all diet when it comes to body composition. And then also, okay, so what do you do with your diet? Well, think about the rest of the animal kingdom, and we're all just animals, right? Like, do you know any other animal in the wild that gets fat? The only animals that get fat are humans and the animals we domesticate. Well, why is that? And the answer is because we've engineered our food environment a little bit too good. We're smart enough to engineer this super tasty food, and then we're daft enough to eat it. That's the simple answer. And again, this is something I've learned from my neurologist, is the hypothalamus in the brain is very good at regulating lots of things, including food intake, unless you put it in an environment that makes it impossible for it to regulate food intake. And, the old Pringles sayings, once you pop, you can't stop. It's true, right? No. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is you put your brain back in an environment that allows it to regulate food intake by itself. Like I wouldn't recommend weighing food or counting calories or any of that stuff, but rather to stick to a minimally processed diet that consists of the one that I described earlier. It's basically meat and vegetables and a little bit of fruit, and you're trying to minimize processing, and especially combinations of food. Like nobody really likes eating sugar on its own. Like if I was to just push the sugar bowl across the table, like how much sugar do you think you could eat? Like just on its own, like not very much, right? It's disgusting. And the same is true of fat. If I push across the bottle of olive oil, how much of that could you drink? Well, not very much. But when you put fat and carbohydrates together, you get cheesecake or ice cream, right? Those combinations are delicious. But you never see them in nature, right? You never see that. You might see a bush covered in delicious blueberries, or you might slaughter, a bear. That's actually my one example that I can think of where, an animal in the wild does get fat, but it does it deliberately. It's part of its normal physiology. A bear, see a bear that's been feasting on blueberries or salmon over the summer, it does get a little bit fatter. So imagine you were to slaughter an animal like that. It's got, hundreds of thousands of calories of fat on it, and you could, eat those, but you never see the blueberries and the fat on the bear together, not simultaneously. So I think the answer for most people, most of the time, to improve their body composition is to keep food simple. Like don't, if you go to a restaurant, well, they're not optimizing for your body composition. They're optimizing for your custom, right? They're just going to make the food super tasty and as cheap as possible. So avoiding eating out, I think, is maybe one way that people can improve their body composition.
Yeah. Well, so I think the question this raises for me is that we're all different, right? We all have different bodies. And I think this is one of the fatal flaws of a lot of sort of information that comes down from the world of diets, from self-improvement, all of it, right? Is that we try to offer a one-size-fits-all solution. So I can tell you as an Indian person, not eating carbs is pretty goddamn challenging, considering the entire diet is carbs. You grew up in the UK, so you know this.
Right.
Like, what do Indians eat? It's like chicken tikka masalas and naans, and it's delicious. It's like, how do we stop this? Like, I remember I tried to do a gluten-free diet when I was living at my parents' house, house and my mom got gluten-free flour to make these rotis. And I was like, these are horrible. She's like, what did you expect? And so, I wonder, how do you account for the fact that we all have different body types? We all have different physiology, because I think too often you see things, so for example, bulletproof, I think, is a perfect example of this. I drink bulletproof coffee and I'm kind of like, okay, are there any benefits to this, or am I just really into the ritual at this point? Like it's become habitual to the point where I don't question it, but I don't know that it's like, is there really any evidence that it's actually good for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like you poo-pooed the N=1 study, whereas I might think that's the best type of study in a way. I mean, I wouldn't like to say there's no value in some of the other experimental designs, like the randomized control trial, but typically those are good for testing out an intervention that's static, meaning it doesn't change, and there are no confounders, right? Like that's the only variable that you're trying to test. And it's really good for pills. It's really good for the quadrant 4 things, right? Whereas for the quadrant 1 interventions that I know to be the big rocks that make the biggest difference in health and performance, those are really hard to assess using a randomized control trial, because there's so many confounders. Think about one crappy night of sleep. That's going to affect your food choices the next day. And you may end up drinking more coffee, which in turn is going to affect your sleep. And now we've got cycles. It's like impossible to tease it apart with a randomized control trial, although it's not stopped people from trying. Whereas I think the N=1, or sometimes called a population of 1 study, or sometimes called an idiographic study, is perfect. I mean, you're telling me that your diet only consists of carbohydrates. Well, go ahead and do it. Get in a DEXA scan, see how you do, and then do something else. Like try a very high fat ketogenic diet with tons of protein and maybe some vegetables, but the bulk of your calories are coming from fat and protein. And then get back in the DEXA scanner and tell me which one worked best, right? And if the high carb diet is the best for your body composition, you've got no argument from me. I've got no horse in this race, right? It's up to you to figure this out.
No, I mean, fortunately, I live with 2 roommates who are not Indian, and they typically, we stick to a pretty healthy diet when I'm here. But yeah, I guess that's the thing. I appreciate the fact that you actually said, look at what it does for you, because I think there's this tendency for people to look at something that works for a lot of people and be like, yes, that's going to work for me, even if it's not.
Yeah, and I think so. It's difficult because I think there's value in both. I already told you that. So Herman Ponce did some work with the Hadza. He went and he administrated doubly labeled water in these hunter-gatherers, and that was one of the ways that he figured out that total energy expenditure is constrained and that you can't outrun a bad diet. You see, well, they thought that the Hadza, because they're constantly moving around, they walk, like a marathon, no, not quite a marathon, but they're walking at least 10 miles every day. And they're always on their feet. They don't own furniture, like they don't even really sit down like we do. So even when they're resting, their muscles are not really completely relaxed like ours are when we sit in an easy chair. And so they assumed that these people were burning, probably multiples of what the average Westerner, but in the end, they found they weren't. They were burning about exactly the same amount of energy because they've just turned down reproduction and other things. So, there's definitely, by looking to the scientific literature and controlled experiments, there's definitely something we can learn about people in general. But the fine details, you got to figure that out for yourself, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've talked about diet. Let's talk about exercise, because not everybody listening to this is a professional mountain biker or lives, somewhere where they can do the things that you and I do, like surf or snowboard. So for the average person, what is normal and healthy as opposed to sort of the kinds of things that we do? Like, what's realistic?
I think about this a lot too. That's one of the most common complaints I hear from our clients is, Chris, I hear you talking about all this pro mountain biker stuff, and then you have all these strength and conditioning experts on, and it's all really high performance. And I come to the front page of your website and I read all this stuff about athletes, and I think, no, that's not really me, My response to that is we're all athletes. You're just not an athlete yet. When I say athlete, I don't mean, track and field events, and I don't mean very high performance. I think of an athlete as someone who's just competent in moving their body, and that we're all athletes. I think that humans have evolved as upright bipedal organisms that are really good at pursuing their food, whether it be gathering or persistence hunting an antelope. Like, we're all athletes. It's just whether or not you have a solid athlete identity, and that's true of you, of a surfer. I mean, you are a surfer, the identity, because you go out there and you paddle out every day, and that act of paddling creates the identity of surfer, like there's a virtuous cycle there. So, if you're currently completely sedentary and you're wondering, well, how do I move more? The answer is, you just take one tiny step, like literally one tiny step. Can you go for a 2-minute walk today? Great. Go for a 2-minute walk. Tomorrow, can you do 3 minutes? Great. The next day, can you do 4 minutes? So by taking these actions in the early days, you overcome that chicken and egg problem. Then you start to form this identity. Before you know it, you're walking for 15 minutes or you're walking for an hour. And then people that who are totally sedentary are saying, what did you do? Like, you used to be completely sedentary like me, and now you walk for an hour a day. What happened? And the answer is, you just made very small and incremental changes over time, and thus developed an athlete identity over time.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the fact that you brought up incremental changes, because I think that we tend to overvalue drastic change and, undervalue incremental change, because you don't get to make some grand announcement about incremental change on Facebook. Whereas drastic change, you can be like, I quit my job. Everybody gets you tons of likes. And, whereas it's like, I went out for a walk. And people are like, why the hell did you put this on Facebook?
Yeah, I think you sort of speak. Is the problem Facebook, right? Is the problem your need to be validated by some external entity, and is comparison the thief of joy in this instance? I started fairly recently, actually, a few years ago, enjoying my cycling so much more when I stopped using Strava. Like, I think every cyclist listening to this will know the website Strava. It's basically Facebook for cyclists. And, you'd finish your ride and you upload your GPS file to this website, and then you got to compare what you did that day with all of your friends. And of course, there's always one friend that went on a 4-hour ride that day when you had to work. And, you compare your ride to them and you think, oh my God, they're going to be so much faster come race day. I don't even know why I bother. And you've just destroyed all of the great feeling that originated from the ride. It's such a bad idea. And I know that people love to compare. It's really hard to find meaning in anything that you do unless you have something by which to compare. But you really have to be careful that comparison can be the thief of joy.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is actually a really good place for us to kind of, bring this conversation full circle, because we talked about sort of competition and drive and ambition. So I noticed when people wear wearables, so I was using a Whoop for a while, right? And my roommate, Matt, uses an Oura Ring, and the sleep score at a certain point, I realized, I was like, is this more about optimizing your sleep score, getting a good enough night's sleep? So I started doing some research, and I remember reading this New York Times article where this guy said that he was so anxious about getting good marks on his sleep score on his wearable that it actually made his sleep worse. And I noticed this snowboarding too. When I would track my speed, I would, check the app on the way back up on the lift, and I'd be like, damn, I thought I was going so much faster than that. And it would immediately kick me out of whatever flow or zone I was in. And after that, I realized, I was like, I'm not here to track my speed. I'm not a fucking pro snowboarder. I'm here to just enjoy myself. So I stopped doing it. So when you think about sort of, the sort of world of biohacking and wearables, how do you have some semblance of a healthy relationship with it without taking it too far? Because my sister, being a doctor, says, yeah, it's great that you can have access to all this information. She's like, but it's also the kind of thing that turns people into hypochondriacs.
Oh yeah, I can totally relate to that. The neurologist I mentioned earlier, he sees these people in his office, right? Coming in, asking them questions about their Oura Ring data. One of the things you should know about, the last time I checked, the sleep architecture detection on the Oura Ring was pretty rubbish, not much better than Chance. It's very good at measuring sleep duration, but the stages of sleep stuff, we have so many clients saying, oh, why am I not getting more deep sleep? And the answer is probably because the algorithm isn't very good at detecting your deep sleep,
Yeah.
But, I work with a performance psychologist. His name is Simon Marshall. He's been another one of those amazing people that took me under his wing over the years. And as he points out constantly to me, that self-monitoring is the cornerstone of behavior change. If you're not paying attention to yourself, you're probably not going to change, even if you want to. And so it's really difficult to try and reconcile these two things. What do you do? I'm not sure I always know the answer, but I mean, you have to look, but at some point you have to say, well, this is not helping anymore, and just ignore that data,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I finally ditched it. I was like, you know what? I'm more stressed out about improving the results of my wearable than I am actually getting a good night's sleep. So I finally realized this is just causing me anxiety, not actually helping.
Something else I've found to be really helpful is not to monitor the behavior itself, but the behaviors that lead to the thing that you want, if that makes sense. So if you care about getting more and better quality sleep, then monitor the behaviors that lead to that more and better quality sleep. It's no good looking at your aura data the next day and say, fuck me, another shitty night of sleep today is going to really suck. Like, that's not helpful, right? Whereas setting an alarm that reminds you to get into your wind down routine because bedtime is coming, like, that's like, and monitor that, like, monitor those behaviors. Like, that is generally more helpful, I think, than monitoring the thing itself.
Wow. Wow. Well, this has been really, really fascinating. I love conversations like this because you've just given us so much to chew on and think about, along with some really practical advice. So I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews at Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Yeah, I think for us, what makes us unmistakable is, when I say us, I mean everyone at MBT. I think of myself as part of a team. And I think it's our holistic approach to health. I think we've gone down a wrong path in separating out health and fitness. I think that fitness is an emergent phenomena from health. And I think that it doesn't make sense to have one coach that looks at your training plan and then another one that looks at your hormone levels in blood, right? I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to separate out those things. I don't think it makes any sense to separate out our mental and physical health. I'm seeing that now as a sort of thing in Silicon Valley is, everybody's into their physical health. You go to the gym. Well, why don't you go to the emotional gym? What about your emotional fitness? As if it's somehow some separate thing, but you can't. Like, those things are hopelessly entangled. It's a dualism, like a yin yang, where your physical health gives rise to your emotional health and your emotional health gives rise to physical health. Like, you can't separate them, right? And so when I think what makes MBT unmistakable is that holistic. I mean, I know it sounds kind of woo when you say holistic, but it really is. It's like our holistic approach to health.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights and wisdom with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and everything that you're up to?
Oh, that would be over at nourishbalancethrive.com. I host a podcast where every week I interview an expert. I interviewed Nick actually recently. He was super good, talking about the dating scene as it's changed since COVID. Like, these dating apps have gotten so many and so complicated, and the world has changed so much in the past few years. I think that Nick did a really good job in talking about dating and advice for men specifically. Each week I interview an expert like Nick. And maybe that's the best place for people to go and find me and learn more about what I do and how we create health and fitness to make that same separation again.
Yeah. Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
Introducing Pendulum Glucose Control, a patented medical probiotic that's revolutionizing the dietary management of type 2 diabetes and improving metabolic health. Pendulum Glucose Control has been clinically shown to help manage blood glucose and A1C levels by unlocking the power of your microbiome. Pendulum's unique DNA sequence strains can't be found in any other probiotic or supplement. Visit pendulumlife.com for product details and use code SAVE20 to save $20 on your first order.